Hey, what's up, Union alum? Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to Union.
Welcome to ReUnion 2021.
We're so glad you could join us for this year's virtual reunion,
where we've come together to reunite with our community safely,
reflect on a year of global challenge,
and rejoice in our faith and our mission of service to the church, academy, and society.
Now, more than ever, our community is called to truly change the world
by bringing a religiously grounded, critical, and yet compassionate presence
to the major personal, social, political, and scientific realities of our time.
We hope the reunion programming planned for this week will leave you feeling enriched
and also reconnected to Union.
We celebrate your return and we appreciate you for your bountiful support.
Through your prayers, through your giving, and through your ongoing devotion.
As my Danish family says, mange tak, which is simply thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I can't wait to see you and enjoy the week.
Fun giving here at Union Theological Seminary, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Union's President Serene Jones, our host for the Knowledge Nourishment web series. Today we are joined in conversation by EDS at Union Dean and the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair of Theology, the very Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, as well as, and I'm absolutely thrilled about this, the esteemed Ruby Sales. Ruby is an EDS alum with a lifelong commitment to social justice, beginning with her leadership as a student freedom fighter during the Civil Rights Movement. She has made the quest for racial justice one of the centerpieces of her work, serving as a consistent advocate for people of color, LGBTQ communities, seniors, and women. She is also the founder and director of the Spirit House Project. So many thanks to you, Ruby, for being with us this morning. It is such a delight. If I may, a few housekeeping things before we dig into this conversation. There will be a 15-minute Q&A session beginning at 11:40. Please send your questions through the chat feature so that I can flag those for Serene, Kelly, and Ruby during that time. You don't have to wait to send in your questions. You can do that all throughout the event. President Jones and Dean Douglas will begin our time together with short updates on Union and EDS at Union. And then we will get into the heart of this event with their conversation together. And now it is my great pleasure to turn things over to President Serene Jones.
Thank you, Shana. That was a wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone. It is really great today to have EDS alums and UTS alums together on this Knowledge and Nourishment. And I couldn't be happier to be on this beautiful spring day with two women who make my heart just spring to life, Kelly and Ruby. Really remarkable friends, colleagues, comrades, sisters, and just bright lights in the universe. So we're going to have a wonderful conversation today. Quick update on Union. We are still remote. That's why you're watching us on Knowledge and Nourishment online. We are going to have our graduation ceremony, which will be the first time an EDS class goes through graduation virtually this year, but we're putting lots of energy into making it a fun event. And we hope that next year it can be a live graduation, and we'll invite our 19, our graduates for 20 and 21 back to graduate in person if they choose to. We finished the renovations of Hastings Hall and have amazing new residence for students. We have a great class that entered this year, and even though they've only seen Union online and only seen their classmates online, they are going strong. We have a lot of exciting things happening. We just launched our new concentration in religion and the Black experience, and are getting a lot of great input from that. And most excitingly, I'm sure many of you read about it in the paper, but we are thrilled to welcome back to campus Dr. Cornel West, who will be coming here in the summer to start his position as the Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. Thrilled about that. So those are just the highlights. There's much more to say, but I'm going to turn it over to my friend Kelly so she can give us an update on all of the things, many millions of the things that are happening at EDS at UTS. Kelly?
Well, thank you, Serene. First of all, thank you for your kind words. And I join you in the excitement on being in this conversation with Miss Ruby Sales, who is an EDS alum and someone whose legacy we are earnestly trying to continue here at EDS at Union, and someone whose work and person and witness and ministry I have admired for a long time. And so thank you for the privilege of being in this conversation with you. And Serene, all that you've said of me, it sounds like I should have been saying about you, because it is mutual. This partnership, this affiliation has been wonderful because of the partnership and colleagueship that we have shared together. And so I thank you for that. EDS at Union, as President Jones has mentioned, we this year have reached the first time where we have a full cohort of all 3 classes, and are entering our inaugural class of EDS at Union. Will be graduating this May, albeit virtually. We are very excited for that, and many of them have already been ordained to the diaconate in their respective dioceses, having successfully accomplished and completed the general ordination exams. EDS at Union's program continues in terms of our academic program, our spiritual formation programming, as well as our co-curricular programming, which includes Just Conversations that I am sure and I hope many of you have been able to engage with on Facebook Live. We also are happy to announce, as some of you have no doubt already seen, the launching of a racial justice fund, thanks to an anonymous donor, in which we will continue this work of being committed to transformational ministry informed by social and racial justice as we try to build a more just future. And finally, I will say that we invite you all to join us in a SU supplemental unit, as we call it here, course that we are sponsoring along with the Union Theological Seminary, that will take place on April 9th and 10th on Pauli Murray. And so it will be a 2-day virtual course on Pauli Murray. So I'll stop there, because much could be said, but nothing more significant than listening to and learning from the wisdom of Ruby Sales.
Yes, well, thank you, Kelly. Let's get started with our conversation. So we are all 3 here today in Women's History Month. If there is anyone in our audience who questions the power and importance of women's leadership throughout history and in this moment in time, then you might as well just, if you don't feel that way, then you might as well just click off, or maybe you need to listen even more. We start this conversation acknowledging that in Women's History Month, we know that patriarchy and misogyny are alive and well globally and intimately in our congregations and in our country. And we also know that when we speak of women, we never speak in a singular voice, that racial formation and location, sexuality, class standing have dramatic impacts on how women experience oppression and experience the possibility of opportunities and access. And if we needed any evidence of that, it's with us every day, but was starkly made clear this past week with a tragic, horrible shootings in Atlanta of women who were targeted precisely because they were women and because they were Asian and because of the systems of exploitation in which they were caught. And we also know that the shooter this week gave religious justification for his actions. So I want to start us with a really sort of blunt question, but gets right to the point for all of us to talk about is the role that religious communities are playing in perpetuating racism, classism as it intersects with patriarchy and misogyny in this country. The role that religious communities are playing to our detriment and to the danger of all women, and also the possible role that religious communities can play in shifting that conversation. Because as I think all three of us know, so much of the roots of patriarchy go back to deep biblical origins in the story of Adam and Eve and the binarisms and oppressions that were set in motion in that originating story. So let's get started there with that big question. And I wonder, Ruby, you haven't spoken yet, so I wonder maybe if you would get us started.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And let me just say that it is such an honor and a deep pleasure to be here this morning and to have received an invitation to be in conversation with two women whom I deeply and greatly admire. Thank you so much for including me in the congregation this morning. I'm so happy to be a part of the congregation. I've been thinking about that question. And I think that in order to approach it, we need to make this distinction, the distinction between authentic patriarchs and wannabe patriarchs. Wannabe patriarchs and authentic patriarchs. And I think that in American society, in the West, patriarchy is inextricably tied into a culture of whiteness. And I think that, and so that they are the guardians and the perpetuators of an over and against system that places men at the top and women at the bottom. At the same time, because men of color are men, they have also internalized aspects of patriarchy, but they are the wannabe patriarchs, and we cannot make their roles the same thing as the authentic patriarchs, because they do not have the systemic power to implement acts of patriarchy. Now, that does not mean that their internalized patriarchy is not harmful. And so that in the Black church, we've historically had to deal with the male hierarchy. And we've had to also deal with men asserting their voices over women's voices and really standing in the way of Black women having access to the public microphone, to the pulpit in churches. So I think that our struggle is very much similar to the struggle of all women who live under patriarchy. In many ways, it's the same. In many ways, it's different.
Yeah, I want to affirm that. Thank you. First of all, just for your wisdom here and your struggle, and I want to affirm that, add something, and then ask you something if I can.
Sure.
Serene, in relationship to that, and this issue of women's leadership and women's voices in the church, and affirming you and adding to that, yes. And I think one of the things that we simply have to recognize that the fight, if you will, here, the struggle, if you will, is not to gain the privilege that men have, right? just as it's not the struggle to gain unjust, sinful, let's name this as sin, since we're just church, this is sin. Anything that negates the full sacred humanity of another of God's creatures is sinful. And so that our task here is not to try to gain the privileges of sin that men have, particularly white men, or the privileges of race. And we have seen in our movements toward freedom that we've mistaken privilege with justice. We've mistaken privilege or entitlement with justice. And so we've seen that white women have fought for the entitlements of patriarchy and not for a just world, right? And,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, and how our churches suborn that. And so we have to, I think our church's role is to be accountable to a different future that is not shaped by the limited moral imagination of a racialized, a white supremacist patriarchy, but by the moral imagination of a more just future. The last thing I'll add there is that means that our churches have to interrogate not simply the overt ways in which we could accuse them of being patriarchal and racist, but also the covert ways, the subtle ways in which it indeed supports, sustains, and legitimates, as Serene said, patriarchy and sexism. It's in the fabric of our churches. What are the icons that represent the sacred bodies of God? What's in our liturgy? How do we do our liturgy? What are the songs we sing? All of these things we have to interrogate, because really our ecclesiastical systems and structures are born out of racialized patriarchy. I spoke longer than I wanted to, but I'll Serene.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I have to do to echo that is to really say that we are not above cultures. Niebuhr says that none of us are above culture. And even as women, although we are victims, we're also predators. And the part of us that have internalized the aspects of whiteness, we then recreate that in our relationships with each other. So the fundamental question is, what is it that we dream of when we create sacred spaces? What are the visions that motivate us? Are we dreaming of the right to become like white men? Are we dreaming of something very different, to become fully human and more relational to ourselves and to God and to each other? In other words, what is our vision? And that's the question that's on the table for women to deal with. Do we want to break through the glass ceiling of the same house, or do we want to build a new house?
Well, you remind me of Audre Lorde's words, right? In two ways. One, Audre Lorde said that we have to excavate, that's not her word, but these are words, that piece of the oppressor that is inside of us, right? And that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So to me, it's about more than breaking through the master's glass ceiling. It's about breaking wide open the moral imagination of what's possible, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And just to add to that is not just the glass ceiling, it's the stained glass ceiling.
That's exactly, and that's harder to break through, right, Serene?
Because it's like glass. It's right. Really, and it's expensive glass, so people are going to protect those stained glass ceilings.
And because it's stained glass, it's as if it is suggesting something about God, right? So that we have to break through that stained glass ceiling, which is the theological legitimation for the daggone ceiling in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's about not having ceilings.
Yeah.
It's about the metaphor that the ceiling, that the glass is stained. The metaphor of the stained glass.
I like that. So can I just, one subtle thing to ask about women, can I, if I may put a question to you, Ms. Sales? Because what the other way in which the church mimics even society is the way in which it does not respect, appreciate, or lift up women's leadership. Women's voices get subjugated. Women's leadership, quote unquote, is subjugated. And so I think of you in so many respects in this regard, even as I think of Pauli Murray in this respect. And that is how those stories, your story, how her story has been lost. Recently, of course, her story is being lifted up. But when I think of you, you know, we often hear the story in our church, and rightly so, and in the civil rights movement, of Jonathan Daniels. And that is a story we should celebrate. His witness is central. And so rightly so, we hear his story. But his story also involved another person. And that person was you. And it was you who, yes, he stepped in the front of Tom Coleman's, I shouldn't even call that man's name, the assassinator's name, assassinator's bullet, and your life was saved as you were there witnessing for a more just future as well. And you have been in so many respects left out of the story, and that to me, and you've gone on in a way that carries forth this rich legacy, and it's one of the ways in which our church even cooperates with the subjugation of particularly Black women's stories and leadership. I just want to hear from your wisdom, how you've managed that through the years and still gone on to do the things that you have done, even knowing that your story has been an ignored story?
I think that for me, the question is whose story? And whose story have I been left out of? And I certainly am a part of the SNCC narrative that my life is a part on. And so that I grew up in a society, you have to understand that the way I approach this has to do with the fact of the impact of segregation. I grew up in a society where white people were as unfamiliar to me as I was to them. And the people that mattered in my life, whose standards I sought to live up to, were Black adults and Black people. They were my significant others. And so that while it is true that the empire story often leaves me out, the most important thing is that the story of the people whose stories I value, whose story I'm a part of, I exist somewhere as a part of that story. And what really matters to me more than anything are the voices in my head that I hear from my teachers who tell me over and over and over again, you've got to run this race for Black people, that you're here, that we educated you for the advancement of the race and for the preservation of our rights and liberties. And every day in my life, I look over my shoulder and I try to see if I see Mrs. Armstrong, my homeroom teacher, telling me if I've done a good job in life. So I must tell you, I don't even think about that because those stories are not as significant as I would feel if I had not lived up to Mr. Charleston's vision, who told me one day that I was going to be a great lawyer because I had a big mouth. and so those are my mother's story, who left a farm, a migrant farm at age 17 and went out into the world and made something out of it and tried to make a life for herself. And some of her aspirations and her hope, she embodied in me. And so I'm constantly wanting to make sure that I've made good on the investments that my people have poured into me. They are my significant others. And I think that because of that, I'm able to enter into relationships with white people, not in terms of what they think about me, but what we think about each other.
I like that.
Well, that's beautiful. And it reminds me, Ruby, of previous conversations we've had about this, and building on your question, Kelly. So EDS has this beautiful statue that was, carved into stone honoring Jonathan Daniels' legacy. And statues are, and all sorts of the icons that we've created around us to commemorate things are really at the center of the conversation about who we are as a nation and how we're represented. And as I listen to you, Ruby, you know, I can't help but think, how is it that we commemorate and lift up life, and tell your story, put those words that you've just shared at the center of those spaces where we see represented the things that we value most highly. Like, I can't ever imagine a statue of you next to John Daniels. I imagine some like live, you know, holographic video of you speaking about all the people in your life that made you and all this wisdom that you have to share. You know, how do we?
I wrestle with that a little bit, Serene. Let me just tell you why I wrestle with that. I think about how Jesus has been dehistoricized and raised above the Jewish culture into the risen Christ that has no history, that has no culture, and that is above the struggle of his people. That while Jesus was an outstanding prophet, an outstanding leader, he was a part of Mary's Magnificat, her song, her vision that she sang in the Magnificat, when she pledged to give her son's life, not to the state, but to the struggle of her people. And so that when I think about my story, I want it to be a part of a continuum that is an unbroken story of Black women's struggles in this country, who, as I said yesterday, who were able to take the rim of a glass and make biscuits. They didn't have biscuit cutters. So the stories of women whose lives were elastic, who were expensive. And so I really do want, I think that more than anything for me, I want my story to be a part of a history. I do not want to be dehistoricized. I do not want to be raised up above my mother. I want my story to be a testament of her life and the struggles that she put into her life. And my grandmother, Ola Sales, who was born in 1863, an ex member of the community of enslaved Africans. It is important that you see that I'm 2 generations removed from enslavement, and that you see not a broken winged bird, but you see a miracle of people who refuse to die.
Yeah, I love that. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, as you said, Ruby, and what it means. And we're both, my great grandmothers, we shared yesterday, was born into slavery, and I knew her. She died, maybe I was 6 or 7 years old. And what it means to carry forth those stories, because I remember once Toni Morrison saying that, you know, in our present, we are connected, we're to a past and to a future, and accountable to a past and to a future. And the past of those women who turned over glasses, like my grandmother did, as we joked yesterday. I didn't know there were biscuit cutters, turned over those glasses and made those biscuits. But I'm also struck, and we talk about, for women in the church and women in general, the ways even in which the church can respond to women, that the trauma that we carry. And I go back to you. I remember as a 7-year-old, I guess I was at the time, watching these scenes of the children that were being attacked by police dogs and water hoses poured on them. I was taking those scenes into my consciousness. I didn't know what it was about, but I took it in. And perhaps today is why I'm so deeply afraid of dogs.
Me too.
Yeah, well, right. That I have a visceral reaction to them that I just, you know, no matter what people say, I just can't get over. And I was told that it's probably from that kind of early trauma. And then I saw it on TV. You lived it, and you lived the trauma of just missing an assassin's bullet. Our foremothers and foreparents lived the trauma. My great grandmother, your grandmother, the trauma of being enslaved. One, how do you, I'd love how you move through that trauma without being bitter. And so many, we know Black mothers and women, period, today, but if talk about Black mothers that are living through the traumas of what's happening to their sons and daughters. So how does the church respond to the, I say, the traumas of mothers, and how'd you live through the trauma?
First of all, the trauma is something that happens to us. It's not who we are. And so let's be very clear about that. The trauma is not who we are. Secondly, that's one aspect of our lives, because in addition to trauma, what you saw with the dogs is that you saw powerful Black soul force embodied in those young people. They were neither traumatized nor were they broken-winged birds, because if they had been either one of those, they could not have had the courage to stand up in the face of those snarling dogs and not run and not scream, and to be convicted in their stance. That was not a traumatized people. So the question is, how did a people who had experienced all kinds of heinous crimes and assaults and commodification and vilification, how did they endure? And they endured through the modalities that they had created and the worlds that they had created, that they had, Ralph Ellison put it this way, that they were not just simply what white people had made of them, they were also what they had made of their own lives. And it was that other world. I grew up in a counterculture. I grew up in a culture of segregation in the South that was a long train running towards excellence. My brother's high school in 1968 had 13 National Merit Scholars and it was a segregated high school. I grew up being a cheerleader. I grew up believing that I could be anything that I wanted to be, because the genius of our parents and our ancestors was that they made the arid soil of segregation fertile with hope and possibilities. And they did that through Black folk theology, not the institutional church, but the theology that said that I am somebody, the theology that says that I've got a right, you've got a right, I've got a right to the tree of life. Can you imagine being enslaved and asserting your right to the tree of democracy? Can you imagine the courage? Can you imagine the imagination that it took to imagine yourself not only to be human, but to be the beneficiary of democracy? And so, and then they would go into the Bush Harbor. Yeah. And they would sing, I love everybody, I love everybody, I love everybody in my heart. In other words, you might control my body, but you don't get residence in my inner life. So Black people developed a strong inner life that became the souls of Black folk. And they peppered that inner life with spirituals, with prayers, with stories, and with movements. And finally, I want to say that Black people have always been in the process of resistance. The first movement in this country, Black freedom movement in this country, was what we call the runaway slave movement. And so these are the things that we draw on. We draw on this, the hope, as Vincent Harding says, that our hope, Kelly, our hope, Serene, is found in history. And what the empire does not want us to know is that every ethnic group who have stood outside of the gates of power have their own stories and their own folk modalities to draw on in order to build up strongholds of resistance. But the problem is that whiteness to just skin. It eradicates all of our other identities. So women don't have access to their gender identities, to their gender history, or to their ethnic histories. And the problem with separating us from our ethnic history is that not only does it separate us from your great-grandmother that you described, but it also separates us from God, our history with God, who God has been with us and who we've been with God. And the empire comes in and says, look, I am God. Yeah. I'm the Alpha and I'm the Omega of your existence. And so that's, I think, I don't know That's pretty long, but I hope I've answered the question.
No, I like it. I'm reminded as you say that I often say that while the enslavers may have introduced the captive and enslaved Africans to Christianity, they surely and certainly did not introduce them to God. And
absolutely.
So, isn't that right? So a God that created them in freedom, created them to be free, knew them in freedom, and that's the God I think of my great-grandmother who and all of those other enslaved women, because they never gave up on a faith. And you're right, somehow it's not the trauma that comes down perhaps as generationally as it is this belief that you are connected to something greater than what others say.
Absolutely.
Are, right? And the belief in the freedom that's the justice of God.
And I just want to say that we can hear it when they pray. They say, God, I want to thank you for waking me up in the morning, not the master. I want to thank you and for putting breath in my body. That is saying that they are, in their prayers, they are offering utterances that underscore and reaffirm who's the master of their lives, who's the Alpha and Omega, who they owe their lives to. That's a radical statement. We look at it as a simple prayer, but it really is a radical statement of resistance that reaffirms that God and not the white enslavers are the masters of their existence.
And just to jump in here, I this morning was reading an article about extreme right-wing white supremacist church in Texas. And the pastor before January 6th urged all of his congregants to go to DC because the great CEO in heaven was ordering it. And I thought, oh my God, if there wasn't an image that collapsed empire and theology just into one moment. And I'm also just so aware, as both of you are speaking about your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, this history, this alternate history of empowerment, that in the work that I'm doing now in terms of dismantling white supremacy, white people have also, because it's to their advantage, have cut themselves off from their own history because
yes.
It's filled with a great deal of horror that their own legacies are responsible for. And you'd think about in that history, I mean, I'm reckoning in my own family with what I discovered to be in the small town in Oklahoma where my grandfather was born, a horrible lynching of a woman that my family could not help but have been a part of. That's my legacy. And those are the stories that also need to be told. And that needs to become part of our history so that white supremacy loses its grip as the totalizing singular story of white greatness and white power and becomes a story of a very violent, traumatized, flawed, and deeply shattering system that was put in place to promote the power of a few. And that is a story that just needs to be ripped to shreds.
And I also think, Serene, that it's also very important, as I think about you, that there are two stories. That story is important, but we also need to hear another story. And that's the story of what is your ethnicity? Who were your grandparents? What were their stories that landed you at Union? Who would have imagined that a woman would be the president, Dean of Union Theological Seminary? There's a story in there, and it's a story of resistance. It's a story of women. It's an important story. So that I would say that our stories are complex, and that white people must not only, because your story is not the empire story, you're not the empire, although white guardians tell you that your story is their story, white people must begin to reclaim their ethnic stories, the stories of their Irish grandmothers, the stories of their German grandmothers, the stories of their English grandmothers. Because in those stories is really magnificent pieces of history that explains why you are where you are today. Although you're a magnificent person, you didn't get to that seat without some women or without having a context And it's not the individual. It's also somewhere along the line, there's a story in your life that's significant that other white young women should understand, that there have been also streams of white resistance in this country, and you must claim that story also.
And those stories of resistance are of women and of men too, that have
Yes.
that are not, that have resisted patriarchy, that have resisted white supremacy, and that have pushed in different directions. And I know we're going to get to Q&A real quick here. I want to let people.
I'd say one thing to that.
One quick question. And maybe you're going to do this, Kelly, but what advice before we move to Q&A would you give to young women leaders or young women as they are coming up? I think this whole conversation has been one long piece of advice about how you frame and imagine your world, but what would you say to that? And Kelly, go ahead.
Oh, see, I wanted to, that wasn't what, I don't know that I have that kind of advice, but yeah, I think, you know what, but you're right, Serene, that in many respects, this conversation, I think, can capture that advice in the sense, and I like this thing of story. And that is almost knowing, telling, and living into your own story, and knowing that indeed, that you weren't, I do think of my great grandmother, and somehow, though by the time I knew her, she didn't talk a lot, but somehow she knew that she wasn't the story that was written about her. That she knew that she was connected to something great that affirmed her full personhood and humanity. And what I would say to women, because that's, you will always be fighting against, right? But it's not, or push, something will be pushing against you. And it's not simply about the resistance to that which is pushing against your personhood. It's about living into your sacred, yes, Serene, yes, that. And the only other thing that I would add to this wonderful dialogue that you and Ruby just had about stories is that Ruby's comment reminded me of what James Baldwin said, that we have to go back and ask what has been the price of the ticket that we paid to become white, and in doing that, if white or whatever, becoming that thing that is empire, as Ruby tells it. And in doing that, the part of the price of the ticket is you give up your sacred humanity. Go back, trace that story so that you can find the sacredness. As Paul Tillich said, the courage to be who you are. And my younger sister would say, we're all dressed up dirt. And that's pretty darn good. To the courage to be who you are. Nothing more, nothing better. It's the sacred dust of dirt of gods. The other thing that I would say that Ruby also alluded to about the story is that, you know what, you're right, Ruby, our story and our people's stories as our wider women's stories, but our story is not simply a story about someone acting up on us. We act back. and so that to me is to me capture the story that is the story of the proactive living in to your very personhood, not simply acting, having someone act against you and you always reacting to it, but to live in to who you've been called to be.
Ruby, you want to say one last thing before we go into
questions?
Well,
I think Kelly has really said it well, both of you. And what I'd like to just add to that is that we must all believe that we're worthy.
Yeah.
That we're worthy of being loved and we're worthy of being respected, and that we do not allow anyone, that we do not participate in our soul murders. And so the question today is, how is it that we become whole? How is it that we speak in tongues, that we give voice to all of our multiple identities? And so that what I would say to young women today is that not privilege your gender over your ethnicity, over your sexuality. That's the way in which the white patriarchy does it. So our task is to become whole. So I would say to you that it's really important for you to to connect with all of your identities and to live into each of those identities.
I love that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you all so much for such an abundant conversation that I'm sure we could continue and keep going, but unfortunately we do have to start, and fortunately we need to start our Q&A section. So we've got a couple questions and a couple comments, and I thought I would read some of the comments first and then pose you all a question. One listener says that let's not forget Judy Upham, Jonathan's classmate who went to Selma with him to help register voters. And someone else says to make sure that we recognize the voices of our Black sisters and the voices of all people of color and women in sacred spaces. Someone else says, desegregating white ethnic stories from monolithic whiteness is interesting. How about focusing on the stories that prompted them to join and benefit from the monolithic power of whiteness? And we have a question. Is there an essential question a young woman could ask herself about herself to begin that inner love, respect, and growth?
As we all look at each other.
Yes, I'm waiting on you to take a stab at that.
Oh, and I was waiting on you. I think that's what I was thinking of, which probably we're all thinking about. I think that's a great question. And I was trying to go back to my own journey, right? And you try to sort of retrace your thoughts. And the question, I must say, that came to my mind, and I don't know if this gets to that, but it was the answer to this question that, as you say, began me toward that place of inner love. As I was saying to you earlier, I watched on TV the horrors of Birmingham and the horrors of the civil rights movement as a 6 or 7-year-old. And it was that, and hearing my parents talk about that and talk about the killing, the assassination of Medgar Evers and others, I think that all came together that led me to ask one day, and I can see it. I'm standing in the middle of my living room. I can see it like it was yesterday, even what I had on and what my dad had on. And I asked my dad, I said, Daddy, what did we do that made white people treat us so badly? And I don't remember my father's answer, but I carried that with me. And because I said, if I could only figure it out, then maybe I could correct it and they'd stop treating us so badly. And then one day, I don't know how much time passed. Could have been a day, it could have been a week, it could have been a month. We're leaving to go somewhere. My dad and I was a daddy's girl. And we're leaving to go somewhere, and I'm on the front porch, and I said, Daddy, I figured it out, as if we were having this running conversation. And he said, figured what out? I said, I figured out what we did to make white people treat us so badly. And Daddy said, what? I said, nothing. They just do it because they can. And that was the most freeing answer. Coming to that answer freed me to know that nothing was wrong with me because I was Black. I didn't get to the gendered stuff yet, but nothing was wrong with me because I was Black. And from that moment on, I felt empowered to prove white people wrong, I guess, but I was empowered. And so coming to the moment of recognizing, I guess it's what Baldwin says to his nephew, that it ain't about you. And so asking the question that allows you to be able to affirm yourself. And that was the conversation with me. That's yeah.
I would just say that, I mean, that question is different if you're a person of faith or if you're not. But for me, at the heart of that question and asking yourself is, can you feel in your body and in your entire being the love of God? And if there's places that you don't feel that, then why? Because that love is complete and total, a complete and total and unquestioned embrace of you. And if there's places that you can't physically and in your imagination feel it, then those are the places you need to go and soften, so that grace and that love can come in and fill you up with the sense of your beauty and your power that is given to you by virtue of your birth as a child of God.
I'm thinking about one of the most liberating things for me growing up in the South was when I was trying to deal with the question of my sexual identity. Mm-hmm. And I was walking down the street and I saw inside this barbershop that had a bookstore, there was a book in the window that said The Well of Loneliness. And it was a story of Radcliffe Hall, who's a British writer who wrote about two women loving each other. Right. And for the first time in my life, I had a name, and I realized that it didn't matter to me that they were women, English women. It didn't matter to me that they were white. And so what am I saying? That part of liberating is not only finding out the particularities of who you are, but being able to connect with the lives of other people, to come out of the small containers of segregation and globalization. So to be able to take into the world, even as we insist that the world take us in, that we're able to find common ground with the world. And the other incredible experience that I had when I came to New York for the first time, I was on the subway, and I saw a sign that said that you don't have to be Jewish to like Levy bread. And I thought, oh my God, the thought that there were other kinds of bread other than white bread that I had grown up with, and that I didn't have to be Jewish to have that bread, was one of the most liberating experiences for me in my life. And so I think that that's the kind of, that's the whole purpose of being a woman, we've always been able to take in as well as put out.
The sheer importance of what you just said, of being able to see yourself and to in the world and to be affirmed. And so I would, you know what, even to that question and raising whatever child God has given you to raise and brought into your life, is to the importance of making sure that they have all kind of representations as they grow up of what creation looks like, so that they always feel a part of that creation, no matter who they are and how they've God has granted them the life to express who they are. I just, the power of what you said. And I remember, Ruby, the day that I heard James Baldwin on a television show in the time when in the 60s, when we were moving from being called Negro to Black, and being called Black was controversial. And I remember James Baldwin was on the Phil Donahue show, and he asked, why do you all want to be called Black? And not in a negative way, because Donahue was okay. And I don't remember what Baldwin said, but I remember the power and the elegance, right? That was James Baldwin in his saying it. And it allowed me again on that day to be Black. And so just the power of the affirmation of who you are.
And then God's magnificent mercy and grace. God has given us multiple identities.
Yes.
And each of those identities give us a pathway to finding people who are just like us.
Exactly.
It connects us in creation. And so that I am so grateful to God that I have many identities.
Yes.
And then as a woman, it connects me with women. As an African American, It connects as the same gender loving. All of my identities lead me to the universality of God's creation.
Yeah. That is has never been binary. You know, I keep saying we need to catch up with God in this world and in our church so that we can appreciate the God who created us all.
Thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation. And I hope that there will be more to come. President Jones, would you please close us out with a few words and a prayer?
Well, I just want to close us out. I don't want to close us out. I want to just keep talking.
I want to keep listening. This is wonderful.
I want to thank my two sisters for their brilliance and for their humanity and the incredible reach and depth of their insight into our world and its brokenness and its possibilities, and how you hold those two together. Oh my God, that is a struggle of being human, and it falls differently on every life, but that's the key to it. So I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Serene.
Well, thank you.
I mean, really, thank you.
Thank you. I echo that.
Thank you. And I think our whole conversation has been a prayer. So it's strange to end a conversation this holy and this sacred with a prayer, as if it marks a different kind of space. But I will end by expressing gratitude to the spirit of love and of justice and of fierce empowerment and joy, the spirit of wholeness, the spirit of history and the spirit of the present and the spirit of the future, the spirit of struggles past and struggles to come and celebrations we have yet to have, the spirit of an expansive imagination and the corners of our world and of our minds and our bodies it has yet to reach. For all those and the spirit that runs through them, I give thanks. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you for having us.